Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are going to get into human behavior. And this comes from the video that we teased last week, and it's by Robert Sapolsky, who is a biologist, and he has an interesting premise that we're going to talk about. And Mark and I have not really discussed this video in detail outside of this podcast. We've saved it all for you guys. So
yeah, this is our first run through of talking about it.
Yes, I think it's going to be good because, there's some things that I think we're both going to agree with, and there's definitely some things that we're both going to disagree with. And right off the bat, I already know we both disagree with his premise that human beings don't have free will.
Right. I don't know that he talked about it in this particular video. I just have heard him speak in different conferences and different podcasts where he does talk about that. Do you recall him bringing that up, that he doesn't believe in free will in this particular video?
Yes, but it's at the very end. So the last 15 minutes, because he does this hour-long lecture, and then the last 10 to 15 minutes is a Q&A.
Okay.
And someone asked the question, so do we have free will? And he said, no, I believe we don't. In a nutshell. And I think that we both disagree with.
Right. I think, it's good to mention that at the start. And then at the end, I'd like to come back to it. And I think we can talk about why we disagree with that. There are other podcasts, I guess you'd call them, or video casts. I don't know what the word is on YouTube that you can find where he'll talk in more detail about that if anybody is interested. But I think human behavior is, it's obviously incredibly complex. I think what drives us is incredibly complex. And I think that most of us believe that we have, so going back to free will already, total control over what we do and how we behave. And I think he makes a pretty good case that there are these other influences.
Yes.
And that's the way I would frame it. Not that we give up control necessarily, but there are all these other influences and a lot of them that we may not be aware of. And one of the reasons to do this particular episode is to let people know that there are these other influences and to be aware of them. And I think that can be really helpful. So he starts off talking about his own, he's not violent, but he has these violent daydreams about Hitler.
Yes.
And the reason he talks about that at first is to introduce the idea of context. And he talks about it, that we don't hate violence, he says, but we just hate the wrong kind of violence. And so, for instance, sometimes in our culture, sometimes war is necessary.
Right.
And so certainly violence within the context of a war, people understand that. And the context, say, of walking down the street, which this has happened, and someone attacks a mother and her baby. I don't know if you saw that. I think it was in New York.
Oh, wow.
And so, that we don't like that type of violence. But his point is that what's going on in the brain and the body is identical, that causes us to behave in that way. And it's just the context that is different. So that's just kind of the overlays, that context to behavior is really important, I think.
Which I agree with. And I think there's at one point where I think he was making a strong case of don't judge people too harshly on their actions because you don't know their story, which that I completely agree with, right? I think it's very easy to judge or to look at someone's behavior and say, what's wrong with you? But you have no idea what's happening leading up to this behavior. And I think that when it comes to snap decisions, that I kind of agree with him in that we don't have a lot of control over it. And we're going to get into that later. But that seemed to be the main premise. It's those snap reactions, those snap decisions that we make inside our head that we don't control.
Well, I like that you're talking about don't judge people for their behavior. That's what he comes to at the end.
Yes.
And I believe that too. I think that a lot comes from the work I do, though, because I get to hear people's stories in a lot more detail and depth than most people get to. And, people are amazing in how they have survived childhood abuse. I've heard terrible, terrible stories. And one of the things I say to these people, it's amazing that you are doing as well as you are, given where you came from. And so I think that is important for us to remember. We don't know the stories of what's going on. So he talks about the layers of behavior. Oh, I want to mention the book. So the book that this comes from is called Behave by Robert Sapolsky. And I may have mentioned it before. It is an incredibly difficult book to read because it is so dense scientifically.
Oh.
I could only get through a quarter of it. And it was so hard. I've had some people say they listen to it on tape and that's easier.
Okay.
I like this hour video because he summarizes everything in the book within an hour. That's kind of easier to understand. But if some of our listeners want to do a deep dive into this, that's the book to do it.
Okay.
It's called Behave.
And in the video, he does use a lot of technical terms. So I also want to put our listeners on guard for that. And that he uses a lot of big words, like scientific words, as a biologist would. And so I don't have a huge background in psychology. I certainly am not a biologist. I mean, I feel like I'm a little bit familiar with human anatomy just because I've watched way too many medical dramas and it fascinates me. But I felt okay keeping up with it. I felt like I could follow along okay, and I certainly don't have a degree in psychology. So if that helps our listeners at all.
Yeah, and I think that's why I like the video, because I think it's easier to follow along. So I'm just going to mention really briefly these 7 different domains that he's talking about. As far as behavior, if you really want to understand behavior, then you have to look at it in different time frames. And the first one is what was happening 1 second before the behavior. And we'll get into that. And that has to do with brain regions, where we'll go after this. What was happening 1 second before the behavior? What was happening seconds to minutes before the behavior? Which, the way he talks about it's more about hormones, what's going on. What was happening hours and days before your behavior. And then you go back to adolescence, which I think we've talked about probably in several podcasts, how childhood, going back to childhood as well, childhood and adolescence, how that affects how we are later in life. And he even talks about influences when you're in the womb, so prenatally. And then he goes even further back, decades to millennia before birth. And what he's talking about is the influence of our ancestors and the culture in which the ancestors were raised in or grew up in. And so he thinks that all of these different domains have various influences on the way we behave. And then he proceeds to explain how that is true.
So our ancestors, the decades to millennia, I mean, I think sure that can have some, but I would almost say that's very, very minimal.
Well, I think as you go further back, it becomes less. I mean, that's what I think.
Okay.
So I think as far as the influence, I think what was happening 1 second before probably has tremendous influence.
Yes.
And then as you go down that list and you're going back, millennia to our ancestors, I think there is some influence, but it's much less. I agree with you on it. But I think he's just saying there are these factors that people ought to be aware of. But I agree with you totally. So let's talk about brain regions. And he goes over, 4 or 5 different brain regions, which I think are pretty interesting. But, as a psychologist, I think the brain is fascinating. And so the first one he talks about is the amygdala. And I've talked about it probably in previous episodes, where for me in the limbic system, which is where the amygdala resides, that is for me the seat of our emotional experience. Now, the way he talks about it, though, is in terms of fear, phobias, and aggression. And I have said this to clients before that a lot of people, I use the example of a bear. So let's say you're in Yellowstone. And a bear comes, if you're lucky enough to see a bear, and a bear comes running towards you, your body reacts first. Yes. And he talks about this, and it's the amygdala, though, that does that. And it's in terms of milliseconds, but still a lot of people think, okay, I'm making this, in my brain, I have this, I see the bear and I say, okay, I'm going to be afraid. But really the amygdala, as he talks about it, and honestly, I don't understand how this works, but the amygdala is triggered and the amygdala knows there is something dangerous coming towards you.
Right.
And And that's, I think, the snap decisions you talked about, because
Mhm.
often the amygdala, well, it's that seat of fight or flight.
Mhm.
Because if we're doing that fight or flight, the amygdala sets in motion, signals to the hypothalamus, which then eventually, as it goes through your body, results in release of adrenaline or
Right.
epinephrine. That's what they call it as well. But adrenaline, which then that's the thing that gets you to be able to fight or run.
Right.
You need that for both things.
And the way he described it is, it seems like the amygdala processes the trouble or the danger before the rest of our mind does.
That's right. That's right.
And
And so it can be inaccurate.
yes, exactly. And so I thought largely of phobias, right? And so like someone who is like, say, for instance, arachnophobic, when they see a spider, their initial reaction is panic.
Well, it's visceral. It's
Yes.
visceral, but that's because all that stuff we just talked about is going on.
Yeah.
And that adrenaline's being released in their body. But I think it's the thing that causes us to react, and maybe inaccurately, and snap decisions, I think, you're talking about. So as we're going to talk about the frontal cortex, and that's the seat of executive function, and its job is to rein in the amygdala. But sometimes it's not that easy. And so you see this in trauma victims all the time.
Right.
That their amygdala is triggered very, very easily, and they react in ways that it really bypasses their executive function, and they make these decisions or actions that in a lot of ways, even to them, don't make sense, but they're almost automatic.
Which sounds like PTSD.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Or I'm thinking, because what immediately comes to mind is soldiers who are suffering from severe PTSD, and something triggers their amygdala, and all of a sudden they're in a war zone.
Yeah. And so all the work that's being done, I think we've talked about with some of those drugs like ecstasy, whatever I keep forgetting the name of that, but what the VA is doing is the goal is to calm the amygdala. I mean, that is what's going on. And even with some mushrooms, with psilocybin, again, the goal is to calm the amygdala.
Yeah.
There's that part. We're triggered by events that are like that we've had that are similar to childhood abuse. And then we often react in impulsive ways or instinctual ways to protect ourselves. And so, in some ways it makes sense, but that's the job of the prefrontal cortex, is to keep us from making those errors. So as long as we're talking about the prefrontal cortex, that's executive function, emotion regulation, impulse control, and really simply put, it's regulating the impulsive nature of the amygdala. He mentions a couple of others that I think are interesting. The insular cortex, which he talks about how the insular cortex is about, we've thought it was about ingesting something that was disgusting, or this feeling of disgust.
Right.
But as they've done more research on it, at least in humans, this certainly wouldn't be true in other primates or animals, that in humans, that it is also moral disgust that gets triggered in the insular cortex. And so one of the things that is interesting about that is that, again, we go back to context.
Yes.
And what is morally disgusting to me may not be morally disgusting to you. So it's very context dependent.
And so I'm going to give a good example of this, and it's a controversial example, but I think it really lays it home. And we're not going to get into this too much because we really try to avoid politics. But for this instance, I think it gives a really good example, and that is abortion. So there are people who consider the act of an abortion to be morally reprehensible, but there are people who consider banning abortions to be just as morally reprehensible. And so that's just a really good example of how context dependent it is. And people have really, really strong feelings about both of those, right? And so when it comes to the insular cortex and what we find morally reprehensible, it really is so dependent on each person. And I really like the way he described it, is that the insular cortex, I think its initial or its base function, or at least the evolutionary function is to prevent us from ingesting poison. And
Right.
so like if we ingest something toxic, we will have a visceral reaction. Like we will start to produce more saliva, we will gag, we will vomit, right?
Mhm.
I mean, our body will automatically reject. It's why we can't swallow most medications. Like if we taste pills, our body won't swallow them because it seems like poison,
So
right?
I think your example of abortion is really good. I think that's
Yeah.
pretty accurate and it's pretty relevant. And that explains, that insular cortex that Maurel discussed pretty well. The dopamine system, which I think is pretty fascinating too. And you had a question on your notes that I'd like to get into about ice cream, I think. So the dopamine system, a lot of people think that it's about the reward itself. But what they found is it's not about that. It's about the anticipation of the reward, not the actual reward or pleasure. And he talks about what we call in psychology intermittent reinforcement. And so if you've ever been to Las Vegas or any place gambling, a slot machine is the very best example of intermittent reinforcement because sometimes you get a payback and sometimes you don't. And for some reason, I don't think he knows the reason. It's just the way the brain is. When we have that intermittent reinforcement, that our dopamine goes through the roof. It just shoots up really, really high. And so that's why a lot of people should stay away from slot machines or anything like that. Any type of gambling, I think, is that intermittent reinforcement.
And see, maybe it just depends on your dopamine. Maybe it depends on the way your dopamine works, because I do not get that high. Like slot machines, I don't get it. I mean, but I don't understand gambling in general. It's it's not exciting to me.
I agree with you, but there are so many people who
it's a problem.
You have that problem, yeah.
Yeah, it's either compulsive behavior, like the compulsive gamblers, or compulsive bordering on addiction for a lot of people. And so you're right. And so the example that he gives is that intermittent dopamine. And so the way I disagreed with him is like, okay, because he said that and I'm like, but I mean, I enjoy eating something. I enjoy eating a candy bar way more than I enjoy anticipating it.
Okay, but see, I think you're misunderstanding what he's talking about.
Okay.
So he's talking just about the release from dopamine, which isn't pleasure. What you're talking about is the experience, the subjective experience of pleasure of eating the ice cream or eating the candy bar.
Okay.
I agree. And they're very different. And so he's talking just about the release of the hormone.
Okay. Because, and then
not the pleasure. No.
Yeah, because he said it's about the pursuit rather than the actual reward. And I thought, okay, again, this seems contradictory, because why would we pursue if we weren't going to get the reward? I mean, and the example that I gave in my notes was we wouldn't do a job if we weren't going to get paid, right? And so like we do a job because we know we're going to get paid, which triggers dopamine. People like to get paid, but we're doing it, I don't know, maybe there's because of these outside pressures on us to do so.
Well, let's go back to ice cream. And again, there are individual differences. And so this isn't true for everybody, because I don't get gambling either. But there are a lot of people who are addicted to it. But ice cream, have you had you just really want, what's your favorite flavor?
Oh, it depends on my mood.
But for me, it'd be anything chocolate or chocolate brownie or something like that.
Yeah.
And like if I can, so there's this place in Hawaii, Lappert's ice cream. And if anyone's been to Hawaii, they would know Lappert. And it's that pursuit of, I've got to go have some of that chocolate brownie ice cream from Lappert. See, that's the pursuit. That's the dopamine that kicks in. It's not actually having the ice cream, which is pleasurable. But it's that drive that says, I'm going to get in my car and drive 15 minutes so that I can go get that particular ice cream. That's the dopamine system.
And that makes more sense, because I mean, I think we've all been there where it's the middle of the night or it's like 11 o'clock at night and you're like, I've got to have this snack right now. And you will go drive somewhere to go get it.
Right. If we go back to, again, the umbrella idea of this podcast, it's about there are these other influences that we often don't think about. So if you're getting in your car, if I'm getting in my car to go get ice cream, I'm not thinking, wow, my dopamine system is really kicked up right now. Maybe I should. I mean, that's not what's going on in my head, but that's actually what's happening.
Yeah.
is my
Okay.
dopamine system is really kicked up because I'm anticipating the pleasure of getting the ice cream. So
Interesting.
that's how it influences the behavior. The other thing he talks about very briefly is fusiform cortex, which is about facial recognition.
Mm-hmm.
And it's triggered, but he talks about, we'll probably come back to this, the idea of the us and the them,
Yes.
or people who are different than we are. And I liked his example because often we think of us and them in terms of race,
Mm-hmm.
which is true. And so when we recognize faces, that part of the brain is triggered, and it is more triggered. It activates more on an us than a them.
Mm-hmm.
But he gave this really interesting example about the baseball team in San Francisco, which is where he lives. And so they showed people, it wasn't different races, it was people with different baseball hats on
Mm-hmm.
for these rival teams. And the exact same thing happens in the fusiform cortex, is that it's triggered by the us and the them, but in this case, it's not race, it's the different baseball team.
Right.
And I think you can see that often in the intensity, I guess, that people have around sports and their teams, which that's something I don't get. I don't watch sports, but I know that is really big for a lot of people, and they are really about their team. Well, they've created an us and a them in that case.
Well, and anyone who's played sports gets that, because it's the exact same thing. I mean, you're viewing the opposing team as a rival. It is very, very much us versus them. And, another thing that I can think of, and again, I don't think this is an intentional response. And maybe that's why this kind of rubbed me a little bit the wrong ways. It's like, well, are you labeling us all racist? Because I don't think people genuinely want to be a racist, right? I mean, I think we have these ancillary responses, but it doesn't define who we are.
And this is a lot more complex than than the time we want to spend here. But the answer would be yes, we are racist.
Okay.
But it's because of our brain. Now, you made a statement, we don't want to be racist, which is true.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't mean we aren't. There's a test I'll find this test. It's like an assessment that you can do that is really good at showing how our brain takes over. These parts of our brain take over, so in some ways I can see how he talks about lack of free will.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to be racist. Evolutionarily speaking, there were reasons for us to be this way.
Right. Okay.
10,000 years ago, there were reasons for us to be this way. There aren't reasons for us to be this way now, but our brains don't change that quickly.
Okay.
So I think that I would say, yes, fundamentally, we are racist and we have to fight to not do that. Mm-hmm. But our brain reacts in a certain way when we see an us or a them. And it's as simple as that. Okay. So let's move on to sensory information. This, I think, was pretty interesting. So they talk about these different research studies they've done. So smelly garbage, if you're in a room with smelly garbage, I don't know why this delighted me so much, but you become more socially conservative. I didn't understand the connection. I want to say that between smelly garbage and socially conservative.
Mark, I can tell you exactly.
I just thought it was an interesting result that that's what happens. And so, you have this reaction and then you behave in a certain way. What did you think about that?
I don't know.
You probably just like that I'm chuckling about it.
Yeah, I know exactly why you're so delighted about it. I mean, I don't know. I guess I had kind of mixed feelings about it, because I was kind of like, well, I don't know. I mean, I think it depends on because whenever you hear of like surveys or studies, oftentimes people will cherry pick their data.
That's true.
Right?
I mean, that's absolutely true. I agree with him.
Yeah. And so that's my problem when someone says, oh, well, they did this study on this. And I said, well, when someone does a study, they often cherry pick. And so or I guess I would want to know more of the context of that study. I mean, I'm not trying to discount it, but I mean, I guess, I don't know, what do they do if they're in a room with not smelly garbage, then
Well,
how do they lean, right?
right. I think the point is,
Yeah.
and for our listeners, I think the point is there for some people, and again, I'm going to say this isn't true for everyone.
Yes.
And for some people, though, there are these other influences on their behaviors that they're not aware of.
Yes.
And so I think the point is just be aware that there
Right.
are these things that influence you. And so the other thing, there were two others that he brought up. If you're
Mm-hmm.
sitting in a hard chair and reading resumes, then you judge the person more harshly
Mm-hmm.
than if you were in a soft chair. But the one I thought was really fascinating, the parole board hearings.
Yes.
Now that they can just go in and do a statistical analysis.
Right.
And
Yes.
so here's what it is. Whether or not the judge gave you parole or not was based, the strongest link was the time from their last meal. Now,
Yeah.
what that's keying into is their blood sugar levels.
Yep.
And so if they saw someone right after their meal, they had a 60% chance of being paroled. If it was 4 hours later, so 4 hours after their last meal, he said they had a 0% chance of being paroled. And I put on my notes, hangry.
Yep.
Have you ever?
Oh, yeah. Everyone knows what hangry
I think
is.
most people can relate to
Yeah.
hangry.
Yes.
And that's all that is blood sugar levels.
Right.
And some people need to be more aware that their blood sugar levels have a pretty big influence. For a lot of people, it doesn't, but for
Yeah.
many people, it does.
Oh, it does for my daughter.
Mhm.
I have a daughter who I can correlate her blood sugar levels or when she ate a meal to her
Yeah.
moods.
Yeah.
And I think that's true with a lot of kids. But I was thinking about that and I couldn't help thinking, well, that's really unfair.
What's unfair about it, Liz?
Well, it's unfair that you get parole based or not on how hungry your
Oh,
judge
yeah.
is.
Oh, that part. Yes. I
Yes.
certainly
And
agree
I
with
was like,
that.
but I mean, what are we going to do about it? Make all our judges really fat and eating all the time? Like, that's not a solution either.
Give them a candy bar, I guess,
I
to
don't know.
punch on. But
Is that going to be considered bribery, though? I mean,
but again, I think the important concept here is that there are these influences on our behavior that we often aren't aware of.
yes.
The next one is hormones. And I think, well, actually, I don't know if most people believe this, but I really know, and from my work, that hormones really do affect our behavior. And he talks about two main ones. The first one being testosterone, and the second one being oxytocin.
Yep.
And I think there is a lot of confusion about testosterone. In fact, Robert Sapolsky has a book. One of his first books is called The Trouble with Testosterone, if people want to find out more about that. So from his perspective and his research, testosterone is not about aggression, but it exaggerates pre-existing traits.
Right.
So I think that when he talks about aggression, he brings up a really good point. I think the problem is that in our culture, we tend to reward aggression with status.
Yes.
And so one of the roles of testosterone is to maintain our social standing. And so he brings up the example, if you're a businessman and your social standing has to do with making money, then it would exaggerate that. It wouldn't exaggerate aggression. He also brings up the Buddhist monks. If you shot all these Buddhist monks full of testosterone, they would then do all these random acts of kindness. And so it exaggerates the pre-existing condition, which I think is important for people to understand.
Right.
It doesn't cause the aggression.
Yes.
The aggression is there, but we tend to reward the aggression. I think it's a cultural problem.
Right. And so correct me if I'm wrong in this, but don't men who have low testosterone struggle with being aggressive, or is that a myth that
No, I think that's true. I
Okay.
think that's true, but it's also they struggle with sexuality
Right.
and desire as well. And so I talk about this with men all the time, because if you take the normal curve or the bell curve and you can plot, say, testosterone levels of a man age 40 under, of all men age 40 under that, and it will fall under that. But what that means is most of the men have this certain level right in the middle of testosterone. On the one tail, the men are going to have very high levels of testosterone. And what I found with that is those men have a very hard time being faithful, say in marriage.
Oh, Okay.
And then on the other end, you have men who are very low in testosterone. And those are the men, they don't talk about it. In our culture, if you look at masculinity,
Mm-hmm.
and I see this in my office often, is we rate often masculinity based on how hard a man's penis gets during sex.
Okay.
And so those men with lower testosterone have trouble with that.
Okay.
But they don't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
But the positive thing is you can actually do something about it.
Right.
On the other end of the tail with too high testosterone, I don't know of anything you can do about that.
Oh,
I mean, you
okay.
wouldn't want to do a castration. That would be the ultimate thing, but that just
Yeah.
takes it all away. But
Yeah.
the men who have low testosterone, they're actually pretty good supplements that you can do that then bumps your testosterone up. But I would always recommend that for
Mhm.
men to talk with their doctor, to have the blood test. If you think that your testosterone is low, have the blood test and then get a supplement if it's
Okay.
appropriate, because it does help. So oxytocin is the other hormone that he talks about. Now, oxytocin, some people call it the bonding hormone. It's released a lot when women give birth,
Mm-hmm.
at the time of birth, to help that being prosocial. Now, he talks about it more in terms of being prosocial, not necessarily bonding.
Yes.
But only prosocial. Now we go back to the us and the them group,
Mm-hmm.
and it's being prosocial to the us group, not the them group.
Yes.
And he gives that interesting, again, it's a research study, more of a survey, I suppose, that I think happened in the Netherlands. And I don't know if you are familiar with the trolley problem. It's a philosophical problem that is used often about what you would do if, one person was tied to the tracks of a trolley. How would you save that person?
Yeah.
And so you make these different choices. But what they did is they gave names to these people. Like if you pushed, so-and-so into the trolley to save 5 people, is that what you would do? But they gave names, like I think they gave German names, Islamic names, and then Dutch names.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. Yeah.
And so this was a study that happened in the Netherlands. So if it was a Dutch name, you wouldn't push that person, but you would really quickly push either the German guy or the Islamic guy. And so it is that us and them comes out very strongly. And again, the people who are doing that, kind of like the parole board, they would say that that wasn't influencing them.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very subtle influence of that us and them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so oxytocin, again, is a hormone that makes us more pro-social, which is a good thing. I mean, I use it, for instance, with couples. Oxytocin is released if you touch skin on skin. So it's released during sexuality.
Yes.
Certainly, I think at orgasm, it's released. And so it's that thing that I do like the term bonding, although I don't know that he uses that.
I don't think he did, but I agree. I like the term bonding. I mean, oxytocin is released when a mother breastfeeds her baby. And
so I don't know that there's that big of a difference between bonding and pro-social. I mean, I think
I would agree. I mean, because if you think about, like communities and kind of the way they're structured, we're more likely to take care of those in our immediate community, people that we know personally. We're more likely to take care of them than we are someone we've never met. And again, it's because there's a bond, right? I mean, if you think of a natural disaster, right? When there's a natural disaster, communities band together and they try to take care of their own and they do all they can to support each other. Whereas if there's a natural disaster on the other side of the world, I mean, yes, we kind of like our empathetic heartstrings are tugged, right? And we feel that empathy for them, but we're not as likely to go and help someone as we are in our own backyard.
Right.
Okay, guys. So as most of you know by now, Mark and I really like to talk. And we have come to the conclusion that we have bitten off more than we can chew with doing this episode in 30 minutes. So we're going to leave it here for now. And we are going to come back to this because, believe it or not, there's more.
Well, we're only about halfway through is what we figured out.
Yeah. And, I was thinking about it too. I should have known. I should have planned for it. But I thought, well, maybe we could just kind of get through some of this technological stuff like really quick. But I mean, no.
Oh, but it's too interesting, Liz. So.
I know. Well, I mean, because we're both passionate about psychology and the human brain. So, That's why we do this. So next week, we're going to finish up with human behavior, and then you will get to hear the conclusion of why. So that's why you want to stick around, or why you want to come back, is because
why
then you're going to
do have free will.
Yes. And I think we're probably going to agree, but it's going to be interesting to hear. So tune in.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.